The morning always began with the same muted choreography inside the small photography atelier. Light entered in a thin diagonal, brushing against shelves filled with cameras that no longer worked and boxes of negatives that had survived decades. She moved within that space with the precision of someone who had built a quiet life, brick by brick, surrounding herself with routines strong enough to keep the noise of the world outside. At 52, she believed silence had become her strongest form of shelter, a place where no one questioned her choices, her age, her pace, or the absence of anything resembling romance. On that particular day, however, something altered the rhythm she guarded so carefully. The door opened not with the familiar creak of customers seeking restoration, but with the hesitant breath of someone observing the room before entering. When she looked up, she saw a young man standing there, carrying a portfolio under his arm and a mixture of awe and curiosity in his expression. He seemed too bright for that space of dust and shadows. At 27, he carried a softness that made him look almost out of place among the remnants of old lives captured on film. Their introduction was brief, nothing more than the explanation that he had recently arrived for an international artist residency based nearby and had been told her atelier was the best place to learn the essence of analog photography. She nodded politely, feeling an unexpected flicker of discomfort. Not because of him, there was nothing intimidating about his presence, but because she suddenly became aware of her own hands, her tired posture, the quiet lines time had drawn on her face. She had long accepted them, but his youth illuminated aspects she preferred keeping in the shadows. He walked slowly around the atelier, noticing details she had stopped seeing years before. Every object he touched seemed to gain a pulse again, as if his gaze reactivated the history inside the frames. She observed him from behind the counter, surprised at how easily he blended with the atmosphere despite being so young. He asked a few questions, always with a tone that never pressed, never demanded. She answered with short sentences, trying to maintain the boundary she had built between herself and the world. Yet something subtle happened when he approached the workstation. He looked at one of the photographs she was restoring, a portrait of an elderly couple holding hands on a bench near the river. He made a quiet comment about how the image carried a kind of stillness that belonged not to the past, but to the ability of some people to love with presence rather than urgency. She froze, struck by how precisely he had described a feeling she never articulated. It was the first moment she felt the fragile beginning of a connection, an echo she had not invited. As he continued speaking, she found herself studying him with a cautious curiosity. Not his appearance, although he was handsome in that effortless way of people who don't know they are, but the way he occupied the space without disturbing it. She realized she had grown unaccustomed to being observed with attention that held no judgment. His questions were gentle, his interest sincere, and yet she kept a protective distance, aware of how easily attention could become exposure. When he finally left, carrying the same quiet energy he had brought, the atelier felt different. Not louder, simply aware of his absence. She tried to return to her routine, but the movement of her hands felt slightly out of rhythm. She told herself it was nothing more than the presence of someone new in a space rarely visited by strangers. But deep inside, an old sensation stirred. Something close to being seen after years of expecting invisibility. Over the next days he returned, sometimes with photographs, sometimes just with questions about techniques she barely remembered explaining. His presence began weaving itself into the normalcy of her mornings. She resisted the familiarity forming between them, though she could not deny the strange comfort in hearing his footsteps at the door. With each visit, she learned more about him. The recent move, the search for genuine artistic expression, the way he admired ordinary people and overlooked details. He spoke about life with a calm maturity she did not expect from someone his age. Still, she maintained an emotional distance, silently reminding herself of the years that separated them. 25 was not a mere number. It was a fracture between generations, between expectations, between public perceptions she preferred not to challenge. She knew too well how quickly people judged women who dared to exist beyond the limits defined for them, and she had no interest in becoming the protagonist of gossip or speculation. She had carved a life that protected her from that kind of noise. Yet the way he observed her work, with respect, with genuine admiration, began dissolving the borders she had built around her voice. She started speaking more freely, telling him stories behind certain photos, explaining techniques she had safeguarded for years. She noticed his patience, his attentiveness, the way he listened not as a student, but as someone searching for something deeper than artistic knowledge. One evening, after he had left, she stood alone in the atelier, surrounded by silent images of unknown people. She felt a subtle shift inside herself, a recognition she had no intention of nurturing, but could no longer ignore. His presence was becoming a small ripple in the still water of her life, and though she feared the consequences, a quiet part of her wondered what it meant to be seen by someone who carried no expectations, no past judgments, only a sincere curiosity that made her question the walls she had hidden behind. And yet, she told herself as she turned off the lights, nothing was happening. Nothing could happen. The world had never been kind to women who crossed the boundaries drawn for them, and she would not risk the peace she had spent decades building. But the truth was already there, silent and uninvited. Something had begun. She didn't notice the exact moment when his presence stopped feeling like an interruption and became part of her daily rhythm. What once felt like coincidence soon took the shape of a pattern. His visits aligned with her quiet hours, the times of day when the atelier filled with soft golden light, and the world outside seemed to slow. He always entered with the same measured calm, never assuming she was available, never demanding attention. And yet he received it effortlessly. Their conversations grew longer. He would ask about her early days in photography, the mistakes, the discoveries, the moments that shaped her craft. She, who rarely spoke about herself, found her voice loosening around him. It wasn't his youth that disarmed her. It was his ability to listen without rushing to fill silences. She realized how rare it was to be heard without being hurried. He often stayed longer than he intended. Sometimes he brought prints to discuss. Other times he simply observed her work, fascinated by the precision of her hands restoring faded memories. She noticed how his expression softened when he watched her, as if he saw something she could not see in herself. She dismissed it at first as artistic curiosity, nothing more. But the softness persisted, and she began feeling the weight of his gaze settling somewhere deep and unguarded. Despite the growing bond, she held herself with caution. The age gap stood between them like an invisible wall she refused to pretend wasn't there. 25 years meant different worlds, different histories. It also meant exposure, one she had no desire to face. She had worked hard to build a life small enough to protect her from judgment, from speculation, from the cruelty that often clung to stories involving women her age and men far younger. She told herself that what they shared was safe only because it lived in silence. Yet intimacy has a way of expanding even when uninvited. One afternoon, while examining a restored print, he made a soft comment about how she carried time with a kind of elegance he rarely saw in people. She felt warmth rush to her face, not from flattery, but from the sincerity behind his words. He wasn't trying to charm her. He was stating what he saw, without pretension, without agenda. She didn't know how to accept it. She had spent years avoiding mirrors, not out of shame, but out of habit. Now she felt as though he was holding one in front of her, reflecting a version she didn't know how to recognize. The distance she tried to maintain grew blurry. They shared moments that carried the quiet intensity of something unspoken. A brush of proximity when reaching for the same photograph. A pause in conversation that lingered longer than necessary. A mutual awareness neither admitted. She told herself she was imagining it, that he saw her only as a mentor or collaborator. But the warmth in his voice, the steadiness in his presence, contradicted her attempts to simplify the connection. Outside the atelier, she kept her life contained. She avoided social gatherings, avoided spaces where curiosity thrived. But he invited her once, just a walk near the river after closing. She declined gently, claiming exhaustion, though the truth lay in her fear of being seen with him. A woman her age walking beside a man his age created narratives she wasn't prepared to confront. Later that night, she regretted saying no. Not because she longed for romance, but because she longed for simplicity, the kind that allowed two people to exist without scrutiny. Still, he didn't pull away after her refusal. Instead, he returned the next day with the same calm presence, as if giving her all the space she needed without stepping back emotionally. She noticed that he never pushed, never insisted, never tried to define what they were. It was she who felt the pull, she who questioned the boundaries, she who feared the story the world might write if it ever found out. One evening, as they worked side by side, the electricity flickered and dipped into darkness. They stopped moving, surrounded by the sudden quiet of a room freed from its usual hum. She felt his breath somewhere near her shoulder, close enough to acknowledge, but not close enough to break propriety. The moment held a fragile stillness. No words passed between them, but something shifted. When the lights returned, the air carried a new weight, a silent recognition neither could dismiss. She went home that night unsettled, not by him but by herself. She had built walls strong enough to contain decades of solitude, yet a single person, half her age, had created small fractures simply by being gentle. She wanted to blame his youth, his optimism, his softness, but none of those explained the connection forming with such quiet inevitability. She tried to imagine what others would say if they knew. The mockery, the suspicion, the cruel questions. She had seen how people reacted when age undermined expectations of romance. Men were forgiven, women were dissected. She refused to become someone's spectacle. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she wondered why fear was the only thing allowed to guide her steps. When had she stopped believing she deserved more than invisibility? The answer hid somewhere in the spaces he illuminated, and that frightened her more than judgment ever could. She had lived most of her adult life believing that desire belonged to a younger version of herself, a woman who had once taken chances, traveled alone, fallen in love without calculating the weight of consequences. That woman had faded slowly, replaced by a careful figure who now spent her days restoring the memories of others while ignoring the quiet erosion of her own. Yet as the weeks passed and his presence continued to thread itself through her routine, something in her began to shift. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was a subtle reopening, like a window that had long been shut beginning to let in the slightest breath of air. He started bringing his own photographs for her to evaluate, not the curated pieces he submitted to the residency, but the private ones he hesitated to show anyone else. They were filled with ordinary people going about ordinary lives, a woman buying bread, a boy gazing toward the sea, an older man tying his shoes by a fountain. He captured them with reverence, as if each person held a silent story worth honoring. When he spread those prints across her work table, she sensed that he was offering her a fragile, intimate part of himself. One afternoon, he placed a small stack of fresh prints before her and let her move through them without interruption. She traced the patterns of light, shadow, and intention in each image. But the last photograph made her breath catch. It was her, though she did not recognize herself immediately. She was standing by the atelier window, holding a camera, unaware of being observed. The light sculpted her profile, touching the silver in her hair and the soft lines at the corners of her eyes. Yet the expression she wore, unguarded and contemplative, was not one she had ever associated with her reflection. She held the photograph carefully, as if it might break. It didn't flatter her. It revealed her. It dignified her. It showed time not as a thief, but as an artisan that had shaped her into something grounded and quietly powerful. She set the print down with a tenderness she didn't fully understand. He didn't explain why he had taken it. He didn't apologize. He simply watched her reaction, allowing silence to carry the weight of the moment. That restraint felt almost unbearable. She was used to being talked over, judged, dismissed, evaluated against expectations she never agreed to. Yet here, she was treated as someone whose presence mattered rhythmically, not reluctantly. For a long time, she couldn't move. When she finally found her voice, she asked what he saw when he looked at that photograph. He answered with a calm sincerity that unsettled her. He described strength hidden within gentleness, a woman anchored in her own silence, beauty shaped not by youth but by depth. He spoke of presence, of resilience, of a kind of elegance untouched by time. His words shook her more than she wanted to admit. She had spent years negotiating with her reflection, lowering her expectations of who she could be, convincing herself that invisibility was a natural consequence of aging. But the idea that someone saw beauty in the very things she had muted felt dangerous. Not because it was untrue, but because it offered the possibility of rediscovery, a possibility she wasn't sure she deserved. That night, she placed the photograph on her kitchen table and stared at it as if studying a stranger. The image seemed to return her gaze. Was this truly her? Or was this only how he saw her? And did it matter? Each time she looked at it, something in her tightened and loosened at once. The person in that photograph was not hiding. She was not apologizing for existing. She looked like someone who had lived, and more importantly, someone who had learned. The next day, she tried to return the print to him. He refused gently. He told her the image belonged to her, that he had only revealed what was already there. She felt a quiet tremor pass through her, the faint recognition of a truth she had avoided. As the days continued, she found herself observing him with a new awareness. His age remained a factual distance, 25 years between them, but it no longer defined him. He carried a maturity that contradicted the stereotypes she clung to. He was present in a way that felt rare, attentive without expectation, gentle without fragility. Still, the shadow of the age gap hovered over every moment. When their hands brushed while organizing prints, she felt a spark she refused to name. When he stayed late to help her sort through archives, she noticed how easily their conversations stretched into comfortable quiet. Whenever her heart softened, she reminded herself of what waited outside the atelier, a world eager to judge women who dared to feel beyond the boundaries assigned to them. And yet she couldn't unsee the photograph. She began placing it in different parts of her home. First a drawer, then her bedside table, then finally, after days of hesitation, on the wall near her mirror. Each time she passed it, she felt something thawing inside her, a recognition that she had not been erased by age, but simply hidden from herself. The question was no longer whether someone so much younger could see her. The question was whether she could allow herself to live in the truth of that image without fear. She didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time in years, she wanted to try. Her life began to divide itself into two distinct rhythms. The world inside the atelier, shaped by soft light, careful hands, and quiet revelations, and the world outside, where she moved through the city with deliberate caution. Within the walls of her workspace, she felt a subtle expansion taking place, an opening she struggled to control. But once she stepped into the streets of Lisbon, surrounded by hurried strangers, she found herself retreating into old habits, lowered gaze, measured steps, emotional restraint. The more he visited, the harder it became to maintain those boundaries. He entered the atelier with the same serene energy each time, as if he understood the emotional climate of the room without needing explanation. His presence didn't overwhelm. It blended, like a gentle layer of warmth added to a cold interior. She found herself anticipating his arrival in the quiet moments before he appeared, chastising herself for it, but unable to deny the truth. Their interactions deepened not through dramatic exchanges, but through small consistencies. He asked questions that revealed curiosity rather than entitlement. He listened with the patience of someone who understood the value of silence. When she shared fragments of her past, her early career, the exhaustion of expectations she never chose, he received each piece with the same quiet respect. There was no haste in him, no attempt to impress or dominate the space. That steadiness made him both reassuring and dangerous. One late afternoon, they reviewed a series of old family portraits she had been restoring. The images were fragile, barely holding together under the weight of time. As she explained the delicate process of bringing life back into damaged photographs, he watched her with an intensity that felt almost like reverence. She brushed it off internally, reminding herself not to project meaning where none existed. Yet the air between them thickened in ways she didn't quite recognize. He asked her, with gentle curiosity, what she saw in the faces she restored. She hesitated. No one had ever asked her that. She spoke slowly, admitting that each face reminded her of how people carried stories in silence, stories that often disappeared unless someone cared enough to preserve them. When she finished, he didn't offer praise or commentary. Instead, he looked at her as though the answer had confirmed something he already sensed. That look unsettled her. As days passed, she began incorporating his presence into her routine without meaning to. She made extra tea without thinking, knowing he preferred it without sugar. She cleared a corner of her work table so he'd have space to examine prints. She left certain projects out because she sensed he might find them interesting. These were small gestures, almost invisible, yet they revealed an intimacy she refused to acknowledge. But fear remained an ever-present shadow. She reminded herself of how the world saw women her age. She remembered the whispered comments she had once overheard about a friend who dared to date a younger man. How quickly admiration turned into disdain. She had survived enough judgment to know she didn't want to invite more. One evening, a sudden storm swept across the city, forcing him to linger longer than expected. Rain hammered against the windows, echoing in the dim room. He stood by a shelf, examining a box of old negatives, while she tried unsuccessfully to focus on her work. Something about the proximity, the confined quiet, made the boundaries in her mind waver. She reached for a cloth near him, and their hands brushed. Briefly, lightly, but with an unmistakable spark. She froze. He didn't pull away abruptly, nor did he hold the contact. He simply let the moment exist without dramatizing it. That calm acceptance shook her more than any bold gesture could have. She stepped back quickly, creating space, trying to steady her breath. He didn't comment. He simply returned to the negatives, as if sensing she needed time rather than explanation. That night, she walked home under the remnants of the storm, her thoughts unsettled. She told herself the connection was a projection, an illusion created by solitude and routine. But a deeper voice whispered otherwise. She felt seen in ways that frightened her. She felt valued in ways she hadn't felt for decades. And though she tried to suppress the rising warmth, it grew with each passing day. Despite her fear, she kept the photograph he had taken of her hanging near the mirror. It watched over her morning rituals, over the quiet evenings when she returned home exhausted. She found herself studying it more closely, noticing the strength in her posture, the calm in her expression. She had spent years shrinking, believing invisibility was safest. Yet the photograph suggested a different truth, that she was still capable of presence, still capable of being chosen. Whether she was ready to believe that remained uncertain. But each day as she unlocked the atelier door and waited for the familiar sound of his footsteps, she knew the distance between them was no longer defined solely by age. Something fragile, undeniable, was forming. The morning of the exhibition arrived with a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. The residency had organized a public event for all participating artists, and although she had helped with minor preparations, she had no intention of being more than a quiet observer. Crowds made her uncomfortable, especially now that her emotions felt fragile, stirred by the delicate connection growing between them. Yet she attended out of respect, wanting to support the work he often shared with her in its early stages. The venue was a renovated warehouse near the waterfront, its high ceilings strung with warm lights that softened the industrial austerity. Photographs hung across the walls like suspended memories, each one a fragment of someone's story. She moved carefully through the space, studying the pieces with polite attention, but her gaze drifted repeatedly toward the corner where his series was displayed. She told herself she was simply curious to see how the public would react. The truth, buried beneath layers of restraint, was far less neutral. When he arrived, he carried himself with the same quiet confidence she had come to recognize. Never loud, never seeking attention, yet somehow naturally drawing it. His eyes found her almost immediately, and the faint smile that appeared was subtle enough to be missed by others, but powerful enough to unsettle her. She returned it with hesitation, aware of how visible such an exchange could become in a room full of strangers. Throughout the evening, people approached him to discuss his work. His photographs sparked curiosity because of their intimacy, their ability to reveal tenderness in ordinary scenes. She watched from a distance, observing how gracefully he interacted, how he listened, how he explained without pretense. Several attendees praised the depth of his vision, noting how unusual it was for someone so young to capture life with such patience. She felt an unexpected swell of pride and guilt. Pride, because she recognized the sincerity behind his art. Guilt, because that pride meant something she had no right to claim. Eventually, he invited her to walk through the exhibition together. She agreed reluctantly, aware of how their proximity might be perceived but unable to refuse the warmth in his request. They moved from photograph to photograph, discussing the stories behind each frame. His voice remained soft, private, meant only for her despite the noise around them. She lost herself briefly in the quiet world they created between conversations. Then, without warning, everything changed. It happened when he paused near a candid portrait taken during their early weeks at the atelier, an image she hadn't known he had chosen for display. It wasn't the one he had given her privately, but another moment he had captured without staging. She was leaning over a work table, adjusting the contrast on a faded print, unaware of being photographed. The expression on her face was focused, calm, layered with unspoken history. Standing beside him, she felt exposed in ways she hadn't anticipated. The photograph was beautiful, but it was undeniably intimate. Not romantic, nothing inappropriate, but deeply personal. It showed a version of herself only someone who truly watched her could have seen. Before she could process it, a small group gathered to study the portrait. Someone made a lighthearted comment about the emotional depth between artist and muse. Another person asked if she was part of his project. A third, noticing their age difference, raised an eyebrow with unmistakable curiosity. She felt heat rush to her cheeks. Her pulse quickened. Her instinct was to step back, to disappear, to detach herself from any narrative that might form. But stepping back only drew more attention. One person jokingly asked if she and the young artist were collaborating in more ways than one. Laughter followed, harmless to them, humiliating to her. She turned away, pretending to study another section of the exhibit, but whispers floated in her wake. Is she his mentor? Maybe more than that. She looks older, doesn't she? How old is he? He's 20-something, right? She could be his... She stopped hearing the rest. The room blurred slightly, as if the lights had dimmed. She felt her breath tighten, each comment slicing into insecurities she had fought so hard to contain. This was exactly the exposure she had feared. Public scrutiny she never asked for, shaped by assumptions and judgments rooted in nothing more than the sight of two people standing near a photograph. He noticed her discomfort immediately. He stepped toward her, his expression concerned, but she lifted a hand slightly, signaling that she needed space. She didn't want him to defend her, not because she doubted him, but because any attempt would only feed the speculation. Still, he didn't leave her alone. He lingered at a respectful distance, his gaze steady, silently grounding her. It wasn't enough to calm the rising humiliation, but it softened the edges of her panic. She excused herself from the exhibition with the most composed smile she could manage. Once outside, she felt the evening air hit her like a wave. She walked without direction, letting the city lights blur into muted streaks. What terrified her wasn't the photograph or the comments. It was the realization that something private had become public without her consent. The fragile connection she held close was now vulnerable to a world eager to distort it. She wasn't sure if she was angry at him, at herself, or at the cruelty of perception. But the truth was unavoidable. A single photograph had cracked open a story she had never agreed to tell, and the world had begun to notice. The fallout began faster than she imagined. The morning after the exhibition, messages filled her phone. Not from close friends because she had few, but from acquaintances, distant relatives, and even former colleagues she had not spoken to in years. Each notification carried variations of the same tone, curiosity laced with insinuation. Some were polite inquiries disguised as concern. Others were crude attempts to confirm rumors. A few were unsettlingly gleeful, as if her life had suddenly become entertainment. She didn't respond to any of them. She spent the first hours of the day in the atelier, trying to anchor herself in routine. The familiar scent of old paper and chemicals usually brought calm, but now every corner felt invaded by the memory of those whispers at the exhibition. She couldn't shake the image of people studying the candid photograph as if it offered permission to dissect her private world. She moved numbly between tasks, attempting to lose herself in work, but her thoughts circled relentlessly around the same fear. What if this becomes a story? What if people won't let it die? And beneath that fear lay an even deeper dread. What if I deserve the scrutiny for letting things go this far? The sound of the door opening pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. She didn't need to look up to know it was him. His footsteps had become familiar in ways she couldn't admit aloud. He approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. The calm he carried into every space felt different today, more cautious, more deliberate. She kept her eyes on the photograph she was restoring, refusing to acknowledge the way her chest tightened. "I didn't expect you to come," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "I knew you wouldn't want to be alone today." The simplicity of his answer unsettled her. She wished he had come with explanations or apologies, something she could reject or argue against. But his presence, steady and sincere, left her with nothing to defend herself from except her own emotions. He told her that several people from the exhibition had posted photos online, including the candid portrait of her. A few comments speculated about their relationship. Some praised the artistry behind the image. Others fixated on the age difference with a mixture of surprise and condescension. The posts had already begun circulating beyond their local community. Her stomach tightened. "I should have known this would happen," she murmured. "You didn't do anything wrong." "Maybe not," she replied, "but I should have been more careful." "Careful about what?" he asked softly. "Existing near me? Sharing space? Being seen?" She closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed. "You don't understand. A man your age can survive a rumor like this. I can't. People will twist everything. They already have." He stepped closer, but not enough to crowd her. "If anyone twisted anything, it's because they chose to, not because of us." His use of the word us felt like both comfort and danger. She turned away, unsure if she was trying to shield herself from him or from her own longing. He shifted the conversation gently, telling her he planned to ask the organizers to remove her photograph from the exhibition catalog. She appreciated the gesture, even if it was too late. The image was already online, already absorbed into the restless machine of public curiosity. Still, his willingness to act on her behalf softened the ache inside her. As they talked, the weight of the previous night began pressing harder. She remembered the whispers, the glances, the laughter that followed the suggestion that the two of them shared something unusual, inappropriate, scandalous. The humiliation returned in waves. He noticed immediately. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said gently. She hesitated before answering. "I'm thinking the world is cruel to women who step outside the lines, and I'm tired. I'm too tired to become anyone's spectacle." He listened without interruption. She felt his attention like a steady warmth, not invasive, not demanding, simply present. When she finally looked at him, she saw no trace of embarrassment or regret in his expression, only calm conviction. "I won't let anyone turn you into a spectacle," he said softly, "and I won't let people speak for us." "There is no us," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "There can't be." He didn't argue. He didn't step back. He simply stood there, his presence both anchor and challenge. "Maybe not," he said quietly, "but what exists between us is real, even if you don't want the world to see it." That truth cut through her defenses. She felt the fragile beginning of something she had tried so hard to deny. But instead of warmth, fear surged. Fear of being judged, exposed, misunderstood. She stepped away from him, needing distance. "I need time," she said, her voice strained. "I need to breathe." He nodded once, accepting her words without protest. And then he left, closing the door with the same gentle care he always carried. When she was alone again, the silence felt heavier than ever. She realized the world had already begun writing a story about them. But the one she feared most was the story she had begun writing inside herself. The days that followed unfolded with a strange duality. On the surface, nothing catastrophic happened. No reporters at her door, no confrontations in the streets, no public scandal large enough to disrupt the city's rhythm. Yet inside her life, the impact felt devastating. The comments circulating online lingered like invisible smudges she couldn't wipe away. Each time she opened her phone, more notifications gathered like dust. She avoided them, though she could feel the weight of every unspoken judgment pressing against her chest. Inside the atelier, she tried to bury herself in work. She turned to the comfort of damaged photographs, centering her thoughts on restoration, on the meticulous process of bringing clarity back to old images. But concentration came in fragments. Her mind wandered toward him more than she wanted to admit. She replayed every moment, the exhibition, the whispers, the way he looked at her with unwavering calm. She didn't know whether to be grateful or angry. What tormented her most was the realization that she had begun distancing herself, not because of him, but because of her own fear. Fear had been her silent companion for years. Fear of being judged, misunderstood, dismissed. She thought she had learned to live with it, to negotiate with its boundaries. But now it felt amplified, sharpened by the unexpected possibility of being seen not as irrelevant, but as visible in a way she couldn't control. He returned to the atelier 2 days after their conversation. She sensed him before hearing his footsteps. His presence carried a familiar stillness. But this time, it felt heavier, as if he had spent the past days wrestling with a storm she didn't witness. He approached slowly, leaving enough space to respect the fragile distance she had created. Yet she felt the pull of him instinctively, an unspoken gravity she couldn't deny. He placed a stack of recent photographs on the table, but she barely looked at them. She could feel him watching her, waiting for the smallest sign that she wasn't shutting him out completely. She focused on pretending she was fine. Her hands worked mechanically, brushing dust from a negative, adjusting the light, trying to seem composed. But the tremor in her movements betrayed her. He moved closer, not enough to cross a boundary, but enough for her to feel the warmth of his quiet determination. That warmth unsettled her, softening walls she had fought to reinforce. She wanted him to retreat, to stop caring, to make this easier. Yet the possibility of his absence felt even more unbearable. She finally looked at him, and in that moment, everything she tried to hide cracked open. He saw the exhaustion beneath her attempt at calm. He saw the shame she carried for reasons she couldn't articulate. He saw the fear she tried so hard to mask. She didn't speak, but her silence carried the weight of everything she was too afraid to say. He responded not with confrontation, but with a steady presence that challenged her to stop running from herself. That steadiness felt like a mirror held with gentle precision, reflecting back the truth she kept avoiding. She was not protecting him by pulling away. She was protecting an illusion of safety she had outgrown without realizing it. She turned away, struggling to catch her breath. The room felt too small, too intimate, too full of unspoken emotion. She needed air, distance, clarity, anything that would allow her to regain control. But when she stepped toward the door, he moved slightly, not blocking her path, but anchoring the moment with unshakable calm. Something inside her finally broke, not in the sense of collapse, but in the sense of release. She realized she couldn't keep pushing him away without hurting both of them, not because they were in a defined relationship, but because something real had formed between them, something fragile and honest, built not on age or expectation, but on connection. She sat down slowly, letting exhaustion pour from her chest like a confession without words. He didn't move closer. He didn't demand explanations. He simply remained present, letting the weight of silence do what neither of them could articulate. As time passed, she found herself speaking, not directly, not in declarations, but in small truths that slipped out through trembling breaths. She admitted how overwhelmed she felt, how exposed, how afraid of becoming someone's public spectacle. She confessed that the world's reaction had reopened wounds she thought were long healed. She admitted she didn't know how to navigate the possibility of being valued again. He listened with a patience that made her feel seen rather than judged. His expression remained steady, offering understanding without expectation. It was that steadiness that softened her fear, giving her room to breathe again. By the time he left the atelier, nothing had been resolved. Yet something had undeniably shifted. She hadn't pushed him away. He hadn't retreated. They existed in a fragile middle ground where honesty had taken its first breath, and though uncertainty still clouded the path ahead, she felt a quiet truth settle in her chest. She wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. The shift in public perception came in the most unexpected way. She had braced herself for weeks of whispers, speculation, and judgment that would slowly carve into her dignity. But instead, something began to unravel the narrative. Not through her efforts, but through his. It started with an interview he accepted reluctantly, one arranged by the residency as part of promoting the artist's work. She didn't attend. She couldn't bear the possibility of hearing more comments that reduced her existence to a stereotype or a spectacle. But clips of the interview spread online, and her phone lit up with messages she ignored until curiosity overcame her restraint. When she finally watched it, she expected discomfort. Instead, she found herself breathless. He spoke about art, about intention, about the importance of witnessing ordinary lives with compassion. But when the interviewer asked, too boldly, too carelessly, about the photograph of the older woman at the exhibition, implying a story shaped by age difference and scandal, he responded with a calm clarity that dismantled the tone of insinuation. He described the photograph not as a symbol of controversy, but as an expression of respect. He spoke of the quiet dignity he had seen in her, the strength she carried, the depth of presence captured in a fleeting moment. He explained how beauty did not belong to youth but to authenticity. His words were free of defensiveness. They weren't performative. They weren't protective in a possessive sense. They were an articulation of truth, delivered with maturity uncommon for someone so young. The interviewer seemed surprised, even disarmed, by his perspective. Viewers reacted similarly. Comments that previously mocked or questioned their connection shifted into a different register. People began praising his emotional maturity, his refusal to reduce her to an object of speculation. Many admired the way he reframed the narrative, turning what could have been scandal into an exploration of human depth. She watched the clip repeatedly, each time feeling something inside her unravel. Not because he defended her, but because he saw her. And he articulated that vision publicly with a level of respect she had rarely experienced in private, let alone in the full gaze of the world. For the first time since the exhibition, she felt the faint stirrings of dignity returning. Later that afternoon, he entered the atelier quietly. She didn't turn at first. The video still lingered on her screen, paused on a frame where his expression carried calm conviction. When she finally faced him, she expected awkwardness, uncertainty, something that acknowledged the magnitude of what he had done. But he stood there with the same gentle presence, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. His humility unsettled her more deeply than the interview itself. She wanted to thank him, but the words felt too small for what she carried in her chest. She gestured toward the paused video on her screen. He looked at it, then looked at her with an expression that revealed no pride, only sincerity, as if the respect in his words had been inevitable, not brave. The moment between them thickened again. Not romantic, not forceful, but charged with something she struggled to define. It felt like a turning point, not because the world had changed its lens, but because she had. For the first time, she allowed herself to see the connection between them without automatically framing it through fear. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence carried its own conversation. He moved around the atelier with comfortable familiarity, sorting through prints, adjusting equipment, blending with the space as though he had always belonged there. She watched him with softened eyes, no longer fighting the tenderness that stirred quietly inside her. As the sun dipped lower, filling the atelier with amber light, she realized that the narrative surrounding them had begun shifting, not because she fought for it, but because he had refused to let others shape it. He had not claimed her. He had not romanticized her. He had not attempted to turn their story into something it wasn't. He had simply told the truth. and the truth had been enough to alter the world's tone. Still, uncertainty lingered. She wondered what would happen next, how the interview might ripple into new assumptions, new interpretations. But for the first time, those questions didn't paralyze her. They felt like challenges she could face, not alone, but alongside someone who met the world with quiet conviction. As he prepared to leave, he paused near the photograph he had taken of her, the one she kept on the mirror at home but had removed from the atelier after the exhibition. He studied it with a softness that made her breath catch. In that moment, she realized something profound. She wasn't afraid of him seeing her anymore. She was afraid of what it meant that she wanted to be seen by him. And that desire, gentle, quiet, human, was something no speculation, no rumor, no cruel whisper could take from her. She returned to the atelier the next morning with a different sense of purpose. The fear that had dominated her thoughts began to loosen its grip, not because the world had suddenly become kinder, but because something inside her had shifted. The interview he had given lingered in her mind, not as a shield, but as a mirror reflecting a version of herself she had been unwilling to acknowledge. For years she had moved as if her worth diminished with each passing season, as if time had quietly erased her right to be seen. Yet his words had revealed another truth, one she had almost forgotten: the quiet power of existing without apology. She unlocked the atelier door and felt the familiar scent envelop her. The room looked the same, yet she sensed an internal rearrangement. The tables, the tools, the fragments of old lives frozen in photographs, everything seemed to invite her to reclaim ownership of her story rather than flee from it. She walked slowly to her workstation and began sorting through the prints she had neglected during the turbulent days after the exhibition. Her hands felt steadier. Each motion carried intention rather than escape. She examined a damaged portrait of a young woman from decades ago, noticing the tenderness in the subject's eyes despite the faded edges. She realized she often restored these images with a kind of distance, as if protecting herself from the vulnerability of the faces she worked on. But now she allowed herself to feel the quiet humanity in each one, recognizing in them fragments of her own emotional journey. As she worked, she sensed something awakening. Not confidence, not yet, but a willingness to breathe again without shrinking. She remembered the photograph he had taken of her, the one she once feared represented exposure. Now she understood it reflected presence. It reminded her that time had not taken anything essential from her. It had simply layered her with experiences she had mistaken for limitations. By midday, she found herself sorting through prints with renewed clarity. She reorganized the shelves, cleaned the corners long ignored, adjusted the lighting she had learned to tolerate rather than prefer. Each small act felt like reclaiming a piece of herself she had unconsciously surrendered. The atelier became not just a place of work, but a sanctuary where she could rediscover her own depth. In the quiet rhythm of her tasks, she recognized how much she had allowed fear to dictate her movements. She had retreated from gatherings, avoided attention, silenced parts of herself to remain invisible. But invisibility had never protected her. It had only diminished her presence in a world that had no right to decide her value. The realization settled in her chest with gentle weight. He entered the atelier later that afternoon. She didn't flinch this time. Instead, she met his gaze with a steadiness he seemed to notice immediately. He moved around the room with the same respectful familiarity, observing the changes she had made without commenting on them. The silence between them felt different, no longer fragile, but quietly aligned. She continued working as he reviewed a series of prints on the table. Their movements synchronized unconsciously, creating a rhythm that felt natural, as if their connection had always existed beneath the noise of uncertainty. She no longer tried to hide the shift within herself. She allowed her presence to fill the space rather than shrink from it. For a moment, he paused near a photograph she had restored, an elderly couple sitting by a river. The tenderness between them radiated through the faded edges. She realized that the photograph mirrored something she had come to understand. Connection was not defined by age or expectation, but by presence, by the quiet courage to let oneself be known. As he continued examining the work, She felt no need to defend the space between them. The judgment of others no longer echoed as loudly. Their connection wasn't scandalous, it wasn't reckless, it was simply human, rooted in respect, attention, and shared stillness. Near closing time, she stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the late afternoon air. The city moved around her with its usual indifference, yet she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. She realized she no longer feared being seen, not by strangers, not by him, not by herself. She returned to the atelier and found him adjusting the placement of a print on the table. Something in the way he moved, calm, intentional, reflected a truth she could no longer avoid. He had never tried to define her story. He had only offered space for her to rediscover it. By the time he left, the room felt lighter, not because of his absence, but because of what his presence had helped awaken. She closed the atelier that night with a quiet certainty pressing softly against her chest. She was not returning to who she had been. She was becoming someone she had forgotten she could be. The invitation arrived unexpectedly, a request for her to present a small collection of her restored works at an upcoming local art event. It was modest compared to the exhibition that had sparked so much turmoil, but it carried significance she couldn't ignore. For years she had remained behind the scenes, letting others showcase their artistry, while she quietly preserved fragments of forgotten lives. Now, she was being asked to stand before an audience not as an auxiliary figure, but as an artist in her own right. At first, she hesitated. Visibility still frightened her, not because of the public's potential judgment, but because stepping into the light required acknowledging her own worth. Yet when she reread the invitation, something inside her responded with unexpected steadiness. She accepted. The days leading up to the event unfolded with unusual clarity. She selected the photographs carefully, choosing pieces that reflected the emotional resonance she had always felt, but never showcased. Each restored image represented a quiet triumph, proof that time could soften, not erase. She polished frames, adjusted tones, and prepared captions that honored the stories within the photographs without overshadowing them. He visited the atelier often during this preparation, offering help without imposing. He watched her assemble the collection, observing the transformation in her posture, the way her hands moved with new confidence. She sensed his quiet pride, though he never expressed it directly. His presence remained steady, grounding, and she found herself drawing strength from the unspoken encouragement he carried. On the day of the event, she arrived early at the venue, a small gallery with whitewashed walls and soft lighting that illuminated each display with gentle precision. She arranged her photographs carefully, adjusting the distance between frames until the collection felt cohesive. She stepped back and studied the wall of images, seeing not just the restored lives of strangers, but the subtle narrative of her own rediscovery. As people entered the gallery, she positioned herself to the side, watching them move from frame to frame. She observed their reactions, the thoughtful pauses, the softened expressions, the quiet appreciation. For the first time in years, she felt present not as a background figure, but as someone whose work held weight. He arrived moments later. She didn't need to turn. She felt the shift in the room when he entered. He approached with the same calm presence that had gradually become a quiet anchor in her life. When he looked at her collection, she saw something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. A mixture of admiration, respect, and something more tender that he never forced into words. Throughout the evening, he kept a respectful distance, allowing her to experience the moment independently. Yet she always sensed him there, steady at the periphery, ready to offer silent reassurance if she needed it. It was a form of support she had never experienced before, gentle, patient, without possession. When a small group approached her with questions about her work, she expected the familiar tremor of self-doubt. Instead, she found her voice steady. She spoke about the importance of memory, the quiet endurance of human stories, the way restoration required both technical skill and emotional intuition. Her words flowed naturally, shaped by experience rather than fear. To her surprise, the group responded with genuine interest. They praised the emotional clarity of her pieces, noting how each photograph seemed to breathe with its own quiet life. Their recognition didn't inflate her ego. It grounded her, reminding her that her work carried value beyond the confines of the atelier. Later, as the crowd thinned, he approached her with a calm expression. She felt the exhaustion of the evening settle into her body, but it was a warm fatigue, the kind that followed meaningful effort rather than emotional strain. She realized she had not once thought about the age difference, or the public's speculation, or the fear of judgment. She had simply existed as herself. As they walked through the gallery together, she felt a gentle shift in the air, an acknowledgement that the night represented more than artistic progression. It marked a quiet turning point in her life, a reclaiming of self-worth she had long abandoned. He didn't need to say anything. His presence spoke enough. The way he observed her work revealed a truth she could no longer deny. He saw her not as someone defined by age or insecurity, but as someone who carried depth, resilience, and grace. When the event ended, she stepped outside the gallery and breathed in the cool night air. The city lights shimmered softly against the dark sky, and for the first time in a long time, she felt aligned with herself. The noise of the world no longer dictated her story. She understood that her connection with him, whatever it became, was not a surrender to vulnerability, but an affirmation of her own capacity for presence. She walked home with a quiet certainty, knowing her journey was no longer shaped by fear. Something within her had transformed, and there was still one chapter left to live. The morning after the gallery event arrived with a softness she hadn't felt in years. Light filtered through her curtains in gentle waves, touching the walls as if reminding her that the world outside had not changed, even though something within her undeniably had. For the first time in a long time, she didn't shrink from the day ahead. She moved slowly, not out of weariness but out of reverence for a feeling she barely recognized, quiet anticipation. When she reached the atelier, the familiar scent of old paper and chemical solutions wrapped around her like a returning embrace. She unlocked the door without the heaviness that had accompanied her for weeks. Her steps carried a grounded steadiness, a certainty shaped not by defiance but by acceptance. She no longer felt the need to disappear into the background of her own life. She walked through the room, adjusting small details, straightening frames, brushing dust from forgotten corners, realigning tools on her table. Each movement felt intentional, as though she were preparing the space not just for work, but for a version of herself she had finally welcomed home. The photograph he had taken of her rested near her workstation again. She placed it there the night before, and now she looked at it with calm acceptance rather than fear. The woman in the picture no longer felt like a stranger. She felt like a truth. He entered the atelier later that morning. She sensed him before hearing him. The subtle shift in the air, the quiet certainty that had become part of his presence. When she looked up, he stood there with the same calm expression that had carried her through the storm of judgment and speculation. He didn't rush into the room. He simply existed within it, meeting her gaze with gentle understanding. Something between them settled in that moment. It wasn't a confession, or a declaration, or a decision. It was an acknowledgement, a shared recognition of the path they had walked through fear, exposure, misunderstanding, and quiet resilience. He approached slowly, as if giving her space to decide whether she wanted him near. She didn't step back. She let her breath settle, grounding herself in the certainty that the world's gaze no longer dictated her boundaries. She felt the weight of the past days fall away, not erased, but transformed into something she could carry without trembling. He stood beside her at the workstation, looking over the photographs she had laid out to restore. Their shoulders nearly touched, not by accident, but by the natural closeness that had been forming long before either of them admitted it. She felt the warmth of silence stretch between them, no longer unsettling, no longer fragile, but full of quiet possibility. She showed him a photograph she planned to restore that afternoon, an image of an older couple sitting by a window, their hands intertwined in a way that spoke of years shared in private understanding. He studied it thoughtfully. She sensed something in his expression, something tender and reflective, as if the image mirrored a truth he carried but never forced into words. As she worked, he remained close, assisting where needed but never intruding. They moved with a rhythm shaped by familiarity and mutual respect. Each gesture felt effortlessly aligned, as though their lives had been quietly preparing to meet long before they knew it. At midday, she stepped outside the atelier, needing a moment of air. He followed a few steps behind, close enough to be present, far enough to respect her pace. They stood side by side on the narrow street, watching pedestrians pass with the indifference of strangers immersed in their own worlds. She felt no need to hide from them. Their gazes no longer held power over her. She realized then that the conflict she had feared most wasn't the world's judgment. It was the possibility of discovering something meaningful and not feeling worthy of it. But the weeks behind her had proven something she could no longer deny. Worth was not determined by age or approval, but by presence, integrity, and the willingness to exist without apology. When she looked at him, she saw not a younger man, but someone who had walked beside her with unwavering steadiness. She saw the way he listened without claiming her, the way he supported without possession, the way he saw her not as a symbol, nor a scandal, nor a story, but as a person whose depth he valued. She returned to the atelier and resumed her work. He sat near her, sorting prints, the silence between them warm and unhurried. The world outside continued its restless motion, but inside the room, time softened. The age difference remained a fact, but no longer a barrier. It existed the way seasons existed, distinct, but not defining. By late afternoon, she finished restoring the photograph. She held it up to the light, studying the gentle intimacy between the couple in the frame. The image reflected something she had finally come to understand. Connection was not about matching histories or aligning ages, but about meeting at the same depth. She placed the photograph down and looked at him. There was no fear left in her gaze, no hesitation, no protective shrinking. She felt a quiet certainty rise from within, a certainty shaped not by romance but by truth. Whatever they became, whatever shape their bond took, she no longer needed the world's permission to exist within it. She had reclaimed herself, and in doing so, she had made space for something real, not defined by difference, not shadowed by fear, just two lives meeting with honesty, at last.